Um, I am a professor of international art education at Aalto University, and my background is in art education, visual culture, critical pedagogy, as you stated, and media studies. So this conference really speaks to my heart, I think, the kind of combination of ideas and issues. So in this talk this morning, I'm going to address art, visual culture, and media education, generally through the idea of promises, problems, and possibilities. So first, I want to discuss this idea of visual culture, because I've been researching and writing about visual culture for a number of years. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on visual culture and art education, and I want to begin by framing the conversation through theories of visual culture. Second, I want to discuss visual culture and public pedagogy, and I'll clarify that term a little bit and how it applies to more traditional pedagogy or media education. Third, I'd like to show some examples of some work, in particular from an elementary school, primary school in the US, where I partnered with a friend and a colleague to do a unit, teach a unit to 5th and 6th graders on deconstructing Disney. And lastly, I want to talk about culture jamming as a form of art education, kind of artistic interventions and how they might be seen in light of art education and media education. But I'd like to begin with this painting. It's a work by Mark Tansey called White on White. And in the painting, if we had time and we were in a smaller group, perhaps we could talk about this work and interpret it in different ways. But I'll give you my sense of the painting, how I feel about it. Here we see two groups of people, perhaps a group of Bedouins and a group of Inuits, seemingly on a unified field. Perhaps it's snow, perhaps it's sand, perhaps it's both. In a sense, both hot and cold, this white field behind them. The unified space affirms the proximity of the Bedouins and the Inuits, but their identity, through their identities, their dress, their modes of transportation, so the different animals, by the way, it suggests that they live in different climates, and yet they're here at this one particular moment. And also, if you notice, the wind is blowing in two different directions, coming together. Have they turned their backs away from the wind? Have they turned towards each other? And what is it that they're looking for? There seems to be perhaps an invisible rift down the middle, the center of this picture. Something's happened, but it's difficult to determine exactly what it is. Perhaps they have to decide at this moment whether they're going to bridge this gap, cross, what the dangers are, if there in fact is a gap or if it's something solid. So in this sense, there's two entirely different climates, two entirely different civilizations, cultures, brought together in a single moment, in a sequence of images that seem impossible to bring together in a singular sense. The landscape perhaps then depicts a kind of collapse of historical time, of cultural difference, and yet this impossible conjunction is depicted, I think, in a visually convincing way. There is a sense of determination here in two ways. One, the figures determined the ground. So if we were to remove the figures, we would just have a kind of white space. We wouldn't really, I think, be able to determine whether it's sand or snow or what it might be. But place the figures in the picture, and then the white background becomes perhaps, or signifies sand and snow. The other sense of determination, I think, is the determination to do something, to meet, to come together to search for that rift or that space, to join or to detach. I think of this painting as a metaphor for media education and art education, at least as I know and have experienced media education and art education. The ground is the same, in a sense: culture, visual culture, media culture, screen culture, whatever you might want to call it, the current conditions of life. The search comes together at the meeting points of the two groups. And yet they often come from different backgrounds, have different training, have different experiences, different cultural climates, so to speak. And what this painting, I think, offers to me in terms of possibilities for media education and art education is this search, this continuing and ongoing investigation, interrogation of space, which remains invisible, and in a sense opens up impossible possibilities. The idea is that something like this cannot exist as a unified field, and yet it still seems to, visually. So I offer this as an introduction to how we might see, or how I see, the relationship to pedagogy, to art, and to media education, again, as I've experienced it. Coming together, thinking of the painting itself as a kind of metaphor for contemporary visual culture, the way that media brings together time, space, history, the way that images are juxtaposed and collapse all sorts of notions of time and space, how they present ideas and narratives and counter-narratives, what they do to create meaning through disjunction, through collage, through impossible possibilities. So what is visual culture, the way that I'm describing it? Visual culture, art education, and media studies. And I think there's a lot of overlap here in terms of visual culture. So maybe, perhaps there's some time for discussion about how you understand the term or what you see as the relationship between visual culture and media studies. But I think it's undeniable that for many people around the globe, life in contemporary times is, of course, mediated through a swirl of imagery, through screens, television, internet, through medical imaging devices, cameras, satellite images, newspapers, although less and less, I think, magazines, digital documents, and a host of other multimedia devices that enhance our sight, represent our ideas, and help human beings see and be seen. And attempting to understand this cultural condition, its symbolic and material manifestations, and its effect on our ontology, its ontological effect, how it helps to shape and mold our being and how we understand who we are, for me is the project of visual culture. And this is a hybrid enterprise that has been around for a little while, at least a decade and a half, in the United States, in Europe, and other parts of the world, in which a variety of methodologies and theories all come together as a hybrid, as a kind of transdisciplinary hybrid. That is, that it's not just interdisciplinary, but transdisciplinary, where it cannibalizes, takes what it can, disregards what doesn't work, brings together different theories, different ideas, different methodologies to try to understand what this current cultural condition means beyond disciplinary boundaries. So different areas of study, such as art history, anthropology, media studies, English, literary studies, film studies, art education, and so forth, of course, have merged together and have done this for over a decade in different departments around the world to engage in this project of visual culture. And there are three interrelated definitions of visual culture as I see them around this idea. The first suggests, as I said earlier, a cultural condition where human experience is profoundly affected one way or another by images, new technologies or newer technologies, for looking, and various practices of seeing, showing, and picturing. How we see the world, how we see ourselves, how we picture ourselves consciously and unconsciously in it. And I want to be clear that this is not to suggest that everybody has, of course, the same experience, the same access to technology at all. But it is to suggest that there is something happening. And sometimes what's happening has a profound or less profound effect on ontology, on being in the world. The second idea of visual culture is the set of images and instruments, the devices, the things that we use that surround us that help mediate our relationship with the world and others. And all we have to do is just look a few meters or less than a few meters away to see how what our relationship is, not just in this room, but reach in your pockets, in your purses, the screens by the door. I mean, you all know this because you are dealing with media education one way or another. So this is no revelation, but this is part of understanding visual culture and how these devices, these instruments, change our relationship to the world drastically, perhaps from the past. And all we have to do is think about our relationship to cameras, to devices that take pictures, to cell phones that have the ability to capture images, and what it's like when we don't have that device with us, or when our batteries fail, or the image didn't turn out the way it should, or we are somewhere and we don't have that ability to capture that image. So the experience itself is lost, or at least not lost, but different, mediated differently. It is in a sense like language. We use language every day, most of us, and don't think about it often. I think if we did, it would be very difficult to use language. But when it fails us, when the words just don't seem to come out, or we say the wrong things, we don't understand why we just said something that we said, or somebody said something to us, etc., then we have a different relationship with language. And I think in terms of these devices and instruments and visual culture, it is very much a part of our everyday life that's ripe for investigation. Surrounded by screens and cameras. And instead of this is a window from Helsinki, actually from a few years ago, a Louis Vuitton store. And this, of course, is interesting for me because it takes the notion of Foucault's panopticon and kind of twists it. So instead of the few watching the many, it's the many watching the few. And our relationship with this, with being surveilled, has, of course, for many of us, changed. What it means to be surveilled, to be looked at, to be on YouTube, to place ourselves out there. This is another Tansey painting, one of my favorites. It's called The Innocent Eye Test. And for me, it signifies visual culture as a pedagogical enterprise, right? So the cultural condition of visual culture, the stuff of visual culture, the instruments, the devices, how do we make sense of it? What does it mean pedagogically? What are we learning? What are we teaching? And this painting is interesting because I don't think it's the idea is basically there are these men in lab coats and they are exposing to this cow, the real cow, a realistic painting, right? A photorealism painting of some cows in a pasture, and the real cow is supposed to recognize or not this painting and respond to it. And the men have all their clipboards and pens and everything, and they're really measuring this idea of seeing purely, right, through the innocent eye, measuring what most registers as a representation of reality. And in a sense, though, who's being fooled here is not the cow, but the men. And the idea of that perspective, for example, or photorealism, for example, is a realistic way of representing the world, or the closest to the real, when it simply is another convention, just another formula in representation. And visual culture asks these kinds of critical questions. What we take for granted is real, what we take for granted as truth and myth in terms of visuality. So often these three ideas, the cultural condition, the stuff, and the pedagogical project, come together. And we use the term, or I use the term, to mean all three. We live in a visual culture. The screen is a form of visual culture, for example, and we are doing visual culture. And I prefer to use that term because it doesn't separate the idea of culture from the visual, right? It's like social studies. It brings together the idea that they are interconnected. As a field of study, visual culture attempts in part to analyze and interpret the wealth of this of stuff, of visual, multimedia mediated experiences in culture. We can call it screen culture in this sense. This is a still image from a talk that I gave in Texas, which was broadcast on Second Life, which I understand is pretty much dying out at this point, but back then it was pretty novel. And my speech was broadcast in Second Life through an avatar that somebody else created for me, a graduate student, and they were presenting this talk at the same time that I was talking, and there were a few people in Second Life who were controlling the PowerPoint that I was giving, very similar to this PowerPoint I'm giving now. And I guess they're able to move faster in Second Life than, I'm not able to control the PowerPoint. So while I'm giving my talk in Second Life, there's arguments going on between avatars. They're arguing with each other to slow down or back up because they can't follow the images that are being shown. And this is all happening while I'm talking, while somebody else is controlling my avatar, while I'm kind of peeking out of the corner of my eye and looking at this screen and looking at everybody else. And at the end of the talk, I was asked questions by flesh and blood members of the audience and by avatars in Second Life, not knowing where to look at to answer the question. So I had to pick somebody randomly to look at, which is, again, a very strange sense of visuality. Now, all of this is it's not that interesting, except it was a kind of novel experience for me. But if we were to take it apart, to interrogate it, to think about it theoretically, what it means in terms of different practices of looking, different ways of representation, different ways in which images function to create meaning or contest meaning and so on, I think it could be an interesting moment, an event in visual culture. And events in visual culture often revolve around everyday life, as I think that you all know, and the relationships that we have with screens, with avatars, with our own identity and other people's identity. So the project of visual culture, the subject of inquiry, its methodologies, are often determined by the conditions of everyday life. So there aren't necessarily, for some scholars, predetermined methodologies. There are whole sets of methodologies, but it depends what the context is. And the context and the conditions determine what are the best tools and methodologies and ideas. This is the sense of this cannibalization, working with what works, making something work, doing something with it, seeing what happens. And that doesn't equate to sloppy work, by the way. It doesn't mean it's sloppy academic work. But it means thinking beyond disciplinary boundaries, for sure. Questions in visual culture that can be considered, created by these visual representations, can deal with the idea of seeing in private and public spaces. This image says, for all the places you don't want your barber to go. And it just can raise issues about what kind of visualizing practices do we engage in when we're in private in public, or what even constitutes public and private, by the way? And how do groups of visualizing subjects determine what's public and private? What do we share? What don't we share? How do our practices of looking change when we're in an audience like this? You know, in a theater, next to someone, you might not know them, or sitting alone, closing the door, thinking differently. And it's not just what actually happens, but how even unconsciously we imagine ourselves seeing. Visual culture can also address how identities have been fashioned in the past and how they're being refashioned in the present through contemporary artwork, for example, which of course we all know many contemporary artists are dealing with these issues one way or another. They may not be overt in terms of identity politics. They might be more subtle or affective. Visual culture understands, I think, that images don't so much reflect reality or some sense of reality, some concretized notion, an origin, as much as they reflect other images, other events, appropriated, co-opt, perhaps even unconsciously. And I think good visual culture studies doesn't ask just simple questions like, is this a racist image? You know, that only gets us so far. But what does this image do? How does this image function? What is its relationship in a sea of other images? How is it contested, taken up, refashioned? Visual culture, of course, as I said earlier, for me is about seeing and being seen. I've written quite a bit about this idea of, for example, the actuarial gaze, which living in the United States in the early 2000s in this so-called war on terror, but I call it war of terror, you could really get a sense of how this actuarial gaze, this way of looking at each other, assessing risk and safety, functioned. Sometimes overtly, where people would be in danger, but often covertly. Visual culture also looks at the way that visuality is represented. This is from Bologna, and I really think it's such a great image. I took the picture there, and I was really wondering what this guy is looking at. You know. I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. That's the thing about visual culture. It makes sense. Nobody was stopping and saying, "What's going on here?" You know? But that's the perfect place to sell that image. And I think a very interesting way to understand visual culture, the past and the present coming together. It doesn't matter, right? It's not a sense that that's not there. It is there. It's there differently. So questions of, is it true, is it not, is it there, is it not, is it racist, is it not? Those kind of questions, I think, are not bad questions, but they don't necessarily get to, I think, the deep complexity and contradictory character of visual culture, as I understand it. Donna Haraway has talked about visual culture, and I really like this quote. She says that the visual is always a question of the power to see, and perhaps of the violence implicit in our visualizing practices. And I've always, because I have a background in critical pedagogy, I've been interested in this question of knowledge and power, how they come together, how they diverge. And I think Haraway is suggesting that, of course, we all, regardless of whether how much biological sight we have or how well that sight functions and so on, I think it's a cultural question about envisioning as much as seeing directly, what it means, how we see others, how we see ourselves, who has the power and privilege to see or not be seen, to be made invisible. So she asked a couple questions that I think are very important to visual culture. One question is how to see. And it seems on the surface a very simple question. And these images, by the way, are from a website on how to see paintings. You know, I have a BFA, I have an MED, master's, I have a PhD, and I still don't know how to see paintings. It's good that I'm in Kiasma today, so I could definitely get some help on that. But before Kiasma, I went to a website and I decided that I should learn how to see paintings. And there are many that can help you. If you have the same deficit as me, there's help out there, I'm letting you know. So, and these websites, some of them are very good because they make it so simple, you know, about looking at elements of art and principles of design, where your eyes should go, how compositions should be put together, lines and colors and shapes and values. You know, when we look at the David painting, we know it's fantastic classical composition, and God forbid one of the Powerpuff Girls should be inserted into the image or just appear, because according to the website, she's cute, she's powerful, but she takes away from the composition. So the suggestion is not that you shouldn't put a Powerpuff Girl on a classical piece of art, but beware of making the wrong choices when either making art or looking at art. And, you know, how we should see paintings, how we should see art. So for art educators, and even media educators, of course, without giving too much power to us as pedagogues, we are involved deeply in teaching students how to see. We might not have the direct kind of power, but we can reinforce dominant ways of seeing, or we can challenge them. I can't tell you how many students I've seen in the US and in Finland and around the world in the art schools that I've taught at when I was a student, sitting in hallways with boards in hand, with pencils, paper taped to the board, drawing the hallway to learn perspective. Middle school, high school, college, Art 1. It looks like the kind of same people all around the world teaching the same things. And if you ask the students why, sometimes they'll say, I don't know. But then secondly, they'll say, my teacher told me to. Or third, because I need to learn perspective before I can draw. It's the foundation of art, right? Why? I'll just leave you with that. It's a rhetorical question. Another question is where to see. Where do we look? Where are we told not to look? Most of you, I assume, or all of you are familiar with Guernica, and this, not a very good reproduction, but in 2003, some of you might know about this event. It happened at the United Nations. Colin Powell, who was then the Secretary of State in the United States, was there to give a little talk about some anthrax and some chemical weapons that Saddam Hussein had, right? So he held up those little baggies, and he made the case to go to war. And afterwards, he went out into the hallway surrounding the Security Council. And in that hallway, or outside of the hallway, is a very large tapestry reproduction of Guernica, donated by one of the Rockefellers to the United Nations. And it's there, I think, to remind the world of the horrors of war. And it is there that people stand up with microphones like this and tables to talk to the media, to tell them what just happened in the Security Council, to make the case. But it was going to be a little odd, I think, and even for the Bush administration, they figured this out, so that it might be weird for Colin Powell to make a case of war standing in front of this tapestry. So, you just cover it up. And that's what they did. They put a blue drape, a curtain. I don't know how many of you have seen The Wizard of Oz, you know. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. They really put a blue curtain over Guernica and had Colin Powell give a talk about war. And this didn't even make headlines in the US. It was buried in the back of the New York Times. This is an event that is significant in terms of visual culture. Where to see what to see for. And it's not just, okay, I'm going to an art museum to see something, but what are we anticipating when we are watching television, for example? This top image from CNN, I remember, this is again about the war on Iraq, in 2003, it's late 2002, early 2003, and I was watching CNN from my home in Chicago, and what did I see on the screen but a black and white image of a street corner, very fuzzy, very grainy, with a couple people walking by every now and then, a car, with this kind of trail because the image wasn't very good. And I was thinking, CNN has lost their mind. I mean, you're media educators, you know the power of clutter and noise. And CNN is profit maximization. What happens to it when they put dead air up? Fox News, right? Whatever, MSNBC. So I was thinking this is ridiculous. Wolf Blitzer has gone psychotic at this moment, but then I didn't turn the channel. And probably millions of others didn't as well, because we were waiting to see something. Perfect idea, like a brilliant idea from somebody, right? You have this grainy black and white image which could be your street corner. It signifies reality, grittiness, waiting for the shock and awe, waiting for that black and white camera to have a flash of white, for the war to begin. The gaming gaze is very similar in thinking about gamers, not necessarily thinking what's on the screen at the moment, but what's next, what to anticipate in the next moment, always in the future, the gaze. And of course, the history of visual culture is ripe with questions of what to see for, to illustrate the difference between civilized and uncivilized, to demonstrate that science can predict and show and illustrate deviance. And images that are appropriated, taken up, transcoded, talking back. And then this very strange kind of relationship with the past and the present. The image on the right is an actual ad from Land Rover. So it is not something that, is a parody. It is, but it's an actual ad that you just have to remember people in a boardroom, it's from South Africa, came together and decided this was a good idea to make this ad. You can see Land Rover in the very bottom on the left. If we had time, we could really talk about this image, what it signifies, how it ties into the myths and the realities of colonialism, of being left in the dirt. We don't see the driver of the Land Rover because we don't need to, really. So visual culture doesn't just ask simple questions, I think, about this image, but these complex questions about the past, about the present, about empowerment. And I hope media educators and visual culture educators don't predetermine the answers with their students, right? You show this image and hope that the students come to the same idea that you have in your head, no matter how critical you are. If we do that, then we already predetermine what's happening. And I think we kind of remain in the past, in a kind of ideological past, kind of archaic Marxist notion of false consciousness. And I think there are very different ideas of how ideology works today, and we need to dignify and honor students' receptions and also give them the language to talk about the complexity of visual culture. Donna Haraway asked whom to see with. Probably many of you have seen this picture, right? The moment when the Navy SEALs were about to murder Osama bin Laden. And this was a controversial picture in some ways because of Hillary Clinton putting her hand over her mouth, and there was a lot of anti-feminist discourse and going back and forth. But the question of whom to see with, as I said earlier, when you're looking at this, for example, or when you're watching a film or in a museum or looking at your own photographs in an album or on Facebook or whatever it might be, not only whom are you sitting there next to physically or in the same room, but whom do you imagine are your seeing buddies, are the people that you share a presence with, even if they're not there? What position do you unconsciously put yourself in through your visualizing practices? This, unfortunately, is a photograph from the university I used to teach at, Ohio State University, so I want to disavow it, but it's true. And this is the aftermath of that other photograph. This is the night after the news broke that Osama bin Laden was murdered. And you can't even make this stuff up, right? Think about this guy with the cigar, backwards hat, USA written across his chest with probably a Sharpie, so wake up next morning and it's not coming off that easily. USA, they're in the middle of Ohio, in this place called Mirror Lake, in which they jump in when there's some kind of event like they graduate. This guy's on his shoulders waving a flag. These are frat boys. There are people enjoying, and this is a more somber moment on the other side, but it's firemen and firewomen in New York watching the electronic news of Osama bin Laden dying. To me, they're very similar, but they raise questions about whom to see with. Again, not just physically. I'm almost sure that image on the right has been reproduced and turned into posters that you can buy in Sky Mall magazines or in the Sharper Image or some shop in the United States. They have these motivational statement posters that CEOs, I don't know if it's the same here in Finland, but it's really viral in the US, you can do it, or some kind of child as a metaphor, get to work and make a profit and, or remember. And so many of these tap into that question of whom to see with. And in the US, there are lots of people seeing things and looking for things. We are a culture that, as I said earlier, is engaged in this actuarial gaze. We're paranoid. Well, you know that. We're not paranoid anymore because the NSA is basically taking care of all of us, so no reason to be paranoid. But in case the NSA doesn't do their job, we have an organization called Marine Watch. So when these terrorists are trying to get to our borders, or even yours, U.S., and they come by the water systems, we have Marine Watch. But in case they actually make it off the boats, we have something called Highway Watch. If you don't believe me, just go to the U.S. sometime, drive down a major highway, and you see these signs. Basically, they're telling you to be on the lookout, or to remind you that other people are already on the lookout. Okay, they've come to our shores, they made it onto our highways, and now they're in our neighborhoods. We have Block Watch, and this is the most kind of prolific signage that you can see in neighborhoods. My Finnish mother-in-law came to visit us in Ohio 2 years ago, and we have a 2-year-old son, and back then he was just a few months old, and so she was walking him around the neighborhood. This is in the middle of Columbus, or in the suburbs in Columbus, kind of like Espoo, and she's walking around, and she turns the corner, and there was a sign very similar to this, but it said, "Criminals beware," with an exclamation point, Block Watch. And because she had never seen a sign like this before, she read it in a way that there were criminals in that neighborhood and she should beware. And she immediately turned around and went back in the house and locked the door. And she called my wife, who had to explain to her what the sign meant. She really thought that, our block was okay, but as soon as you turn the corner, there are criminals there. Which would be kind of nice if you have a sign that says, "Don't go down this block. You might get robbed." And this is another great irony, I love this sign. If I don't call the police, my neighbor will. It's a very strange neighborhood. Everybody's saying that to each other. I'm not going to call the police, will you? No, I won't, but my neighbor will. It just keeps going in a circular way. But okay, they're in your block. Where are they hiding? It's okay, they'll find them because the Air Force has this eagle eyes. They fly above, they surveil, they look. But let's just say none of this works, and you're still paranoid. You're still a good American, right? You're still like that sign, that picture that we saw, being on the lookout. Well, you can hire a group called Cat Eyes. And this is my favorite. It's the Community Anti-Terrorism Training Institute. Look it up, right? Go through your screens. These folks come to your home. You can have tea and cookies ready for them. And for a small amount of money, they will teach you how to be on the lookout for terrorists or bad guys or whomever. And go online and see some of their literature. One of the most fascinating and disgusting things is in one of their flyers, it says something like, if you see somebody in your workplace or home that looks like they don't belong, there's probably a reason for that. So if you see somebody that doesn't belong, there's probably a reason for that. So they're already setting up that, okay, don't worry, you're not racist, you're not xenophobic, you're just a good old American like everybody else. And if you think you're paranoid, you're not, and we'll help you make sure that you're not. And they teach you how to be, on the lookout, how to surveil, different practices of looking. What limits division? When is seeing not believing? When is believing seeing? Who gets to have more than one point of view? And I think for media educators, of course, this is a very important question. When you have, I think now it's even less than 6, these oligopolies that own most of the media in the world. And at least in the United States, their presence is felt. Right? They can recycle images over and over again. They can self-censor. They can produce things and reproduce things in which seems just common sense. This is not to suggest that there's, the man who's controlling us, but it is and that we don't have any agency. It is to suggest that there are companies that have enormous, extraordinary amounts of power and wealth that own a significant amount of media, and questions of their effect are legitimate and important in visual culture. This is a photograph that I took at Fallingwater House in Pennsylvania. It's a Frank Lloyd Wright house, very important piece of American architecture. It's in the middle of the woods, so you have to kind of drive a long distance to get there. You go, you pay your fee, you come across this kind of crossroads, these paths, and there's a sign, a concrete sign that's, as you can see, says the word view chiseled into it. And, I came to that place, and my heart started beating a little faster. I started to sweat just a tiny bit because I had to decide where I was going to go. And if I went down, if I kept going straight, what would happen to me? What kind of science fiction experience would I have where I would go into some kind of black hole? There would be no more view, or the view just would not be very interesting. So of course I'm like all other good, educated and cultured subjects who's learned art history and architecture. So I went to, of course, see the image of Fallingwater that I had seen many times in books, that I then took a photograph of that looked exactly like the photographs in the books that I could then show to everybody else to say I was there. And I had to actually wait in line behind other people to get that same photograph. So there's a well-worn path to a rock which you stand on, which you get the picturesque view of the house that does look just like the one in the books, because that's the one you want, right? This, to me, is, it's rare to find a concrete post that says view, I think. I haven't come across many of them. But in visual culture, I think it acts as a metaphor. These exist everywhere, invisibly. Right? Where to go, how to see, where to see, whom to see with, when to see, who interprets the visual field. Remember the image I showed you earlier? Probably most of you know this, but in an Israeli newspaper, very conservative newspaper, I don't know if you can tell the difference. It's like one of those children's magazines, Can you find the difference? What happened to Hillary Clinton? Where's Waldo? Where's Hillary? gone. And the other woman as well, gone. Because you just can't show women in this newspaper. It's that simple. So you just erase them. It's easy. This is from Hurricane Katrina. Same day. And this is on AP. A young man walks through chest-deep flood water after looting a grocery store in New Orleans, blah, blah, blah. Looting, stealing, breaking into a place, right? Looting is, it's what the Vikings did, basically. Same day. 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. Residents? At least he's a young man, so at least that language is okay. He looted, they found. Both of these photographs were taken without any context, or at least without the photographers having seen what had happened. All of these people were floating in this terrible water. Were these commentaries racist? Were they members of the Ku Klux Klan? No. I mean, maybe, but I don't think so. It's a question of cultural condition and ways of seeing. And this caused a lot of controversy, and perhaps this doesn't happen this blatantly, but it happens all the time to some extent. This is the violence implicit in our visualizing practices. So art education is attempting to understand this idea of visual culture. And what we are trying to do, at least in the United States, is ask the grand question of what can be created of what we have been conditioned to see. And one of the ways that we are thinking about this is through public pedagogy. And basically, public pedagogy is the idea that schools are no longer or maybe haven't been for a very long time, the main site of learning. And through public pedagogy, the idea of what constitutes public good, the public sphere, even public protest has been co-opted, is open to neoliberal co-option, the idea that the market determines public good, public welfare. And you can feel this here in Finland a little bit, but I think you're still very fortunate in terms of what your relationship to social welfare and the United States and public good. But I'm very concerned about the creeping neoliberalist discourse that's coming in to your institutions, to the institution I'm part of, to the public discourse on what constitutes good, discussions of tuition, immigration, education, whatever it might be. You're quite far from the US, which I feel very fortunate to be here, but I have great concerns. And in the US, this idea of public pedagogy asks questions or interrogates this notion of what's being learned, what's being taught primarily through corporate and neoliberal discourse, where choice is a replacement for citizenship, or better yet, choice equals citizenship, where public spaces are privatized everywhere you go. Schools in the United States have to sell their space to advertisers. They have Channel 1 broadcast in. Kids, as you might know, have to collect box tops of cereals in order to get money to go to school so they can have computers and books. My stepdaughters thought this was very strange that Target was collecting these box tops for their schools. I mean, it's just one small example. But even the notion of schooling itself is claimed in this public pedagogy. So, public pedagogy also includes the idea of kids learning through popular culture and through media. And one of my colleagues decided to do a unit for his 5th and 6th graders on deconstructing Disney, and we wrote an article together, and he did his master's thesis on this. He started off, and these again are 11-year-old kids, 12-year-old kids, talking about issues. Not Disney per se, not starting with Disney, but issues. What is an issue? When do issues come up? Where do you hear about them? On the playground, at home, and TV? And then leading into discussions of abuse, verbal and physical, power, representation. Students looked at representations of Native Americans, for example, in the US. And if you know, things have become better, but they're still very bad for the first Americans, as they're represented as mascots, as animals. In the nation's capital, you have the Redskins as the football team. This says a lot about our country, my country. So students started to investigate the idea of representations. They then looked at representations of gender and class and race and looked at Disney films. And there's a lot written about this, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with looking at some of the animated films and representations of women giving up your voice to get legs, to get a man you've never actually spoken to before. Representations in Aladdin, who has the darker skin, who has the lighter skin, who has the English accent, who sounds like they're from California, who's violent, what constitutes violence in terms of culture. Then, of course, older, more blatant Disney films where animals have articulate certain slang and voices of marginalized individuals. But even the more recent film of Tarzan that was done about 10 years ago or so, where there are no Africans, no black Africans in the entire film, in the entire animated film. And Dave, my colleague, had a conversation with his students about this. And he raised this question. And one of the kids, a 6-year-old kid, raised his hand innocently and said, "Yes, there is, Mr. Anderson. They're the gorillas." And this is not a racist kid. He's 11 years old. And other kids started saying gorillas are not human beings. And then they started talking about the representations in this film and other films. Not to blame Disney, to boycott Disney, to make Disney an evil empire, even though it might be, but not to make Disney an evil empire, but to talk about it as a dominant form of storytelling. Pocahontas. He showed like 7 different versions of history of Pocahontas, including Disney. Then the students made artworks that dealt with relationships of love, respect. This is by an Asian American student who wanted to know why all the representations of cats in Disney films have Asian accents. Beauty. And this one was interesting. It's a young man who felt the pressure of being on a sports team, of being in a little league, and he had no one else to speak to. And he told Dave that he wasn't so much interested in these other topics, and he wanted to do something that was affecting him directly. So he made this artwork that deal with masculinity and the pressure he felt of being a young man by his family, by his coach. Okay, so another manifestation that art education has been dealing with to address public pedagogy is culture jamming. And I wanted to show you a clip from the Yes Men, but there's no time, so I'll just tell you to Google it if you haven't seen it. It actually occurred here in Finland, in Tampere, in 2001, at a conference on, I think, the future of textiles. And, well, you have to see it. It's about a golden phallus, so I'll just leave that out there for you. So you can look at it right now and not listen to me. It's okay, no problem. Okay, so just a couple quick examples of some students in the US, some undergraduate or bachelor art students that were thinking about intervening through culture jamming. And one of the students, this is at New York University, was doing her project looking at surveillance and looking at artists who had problematized the notion of surveillance and brought it to attention. So she looked at a couple different people, and I can give you the names later of the artists if you're interested, who self-surveilled, who brought attention to surveillance cameras, who made themselves public 24 hours a day. And then she looked at this technology, which is supposed to block out pixelate a person's face and body when they're being surveilled, like if they're going through an airport. And then she made an invisible suit. And she walked around New York City with this invisible suit. And the idea is that it pixelated herself to call attention to this idea that it's okay to surveil as long as you're pixelated. And she stood in front of video cameras with this suit and performed. And then the last one I'll show you is a student of mine who had one of her friends had applied for a job as a teacher, but didn't get the job because whoever was hiring, the HR person, said that even though the resume was fine, his or her background, I can't remember if it was a man or a woman, there were some problems because of things they had posted on a social network. And I'm not making this up. And she was shocked. Then she did all this research to find out there are actual companies out there that corporations and schools hire to do research. So if you put something on Twitter or Facebook, beware. And it's scary as hell. So what she decided is to create a appropriated website called Social Relocation. And this website cleans it up for you. So if you go to this website and you have a personal problem, you got drunk, you tweeted in Vegas how much you hated your boss, and oops, they're going to take care of it for you. For a small fee, they'll go in and they'll clean up all of your social network faux pas. Social relocation. So she appropriated a website of a company that did exactly the opposite. She bought her own domain name and then created this company as a parody, as a form of culture jamming, which I think ties very nicely in with media education, at least as I understand it and have practiced it. I bought lingerie and they used my real name in a satisfied comment on their website. My friend tagged me in a sexually compromising photo that became viral. P.S. I don't like dogs. So wherever you are, whatever happened, they'll take care of it. No worries, for a certain fee, and you can get that job and feel rest assured. So these are some examples of what I consider culture jamming in response to public pedagogy, broadly informed by visual culture. And I think that I hope that I was able to make some relationships between art education, visual culture, and media studies, and open up some possibilities for you to think of. Thank you very much.